Welcome back to Invest Africa. Well, Africa has been looking to increase trade rather than aid as a way to alleviate poverty. According to economists, say 2% increase in Africa's share of global trade could halve unemployment. And when it comes down to agricultural land, Africa has a significant global competitive advantage, a position that it needs to make use of.
Even though agribusiness is regarded as a risky endeavour, over the past few years, companies and foreign governments have been acquiring land in some of Africa's poorest countries.
Food security has moved up the international agenda, particularly with China, because with their population and their growth, they can't feed themselves. So they've got to be looking for other land. And so we're finding India showing interest, Brazil, Israel, who've got some amazing technology. And then from Europe as well. So there's a lot of interest, far more now than there's been in the last 12 years.
If the correct measures are put in place, foreign investment can help African countries create jobs, increase foreign earnings, and use more advanced technologies.
I'd rather go into partnership with the landowner, and we form a joint venture with them. However, there are many countries that don't share that view. China is one. India's also had cases where they bought up quite large pieces of land.
But there has been concerns raised that poor villagers will be forced off their land and agribusiness may marginalise family farming.
Then there are other cases where, for example, the local government have allocated land, but they haven't consulted the people. And the peasant folk sometimes don't like it, and that can present difficulties.
Farmers all over the continent are faced with challenges that have also impeded the growth of the agricultural sector. Casper Botha, a South African commercial farmer who has been in the farming business for over 2 decades, explains why the country's regulatory framework has made it difficult to stay competitive.
Having protection in our financial instruments and selling agricultural products in South Africa, because we get dumping from European American companies here that is being subsidized by their governments, and we are not have a level play field to those farmers.
The global demand for food and agricultural commodities creates a new opportunity for African farmers, and the need for public policies and infrastructure to support those agricultural sectors is evident now more than ever. Tumisho Mahanyele, Johannesburg.
Let's get straight back into conversation now. And John, we were talking about finding funders, financiers of projects. What about the need to find relevant partners? We had this highlighted in the insert there, especially for foreign entities going into a country. Is it a trend that you see developing, or is there more of an aversion?
No, there's certainly a trend of foreign countries investing into Africa. We are concerned about some of those models that they are investing in, as was alluded to. We believe from South Africa, where we represent a number of agribusinesses investing into Africa, that you must have a responsible protocol that you invest according to. In other words, also involving the local population. Try and bring the smallholders into the commercial value chains, etc. Some of those models are just to produce for themselves. They bring the labourers, they bring everything, they bring the technology, and they just export.
So we need to
produce.
See more beneficiation happening.
We need to see involvement of the local communities. We need to see beneficiation in those areas. Otherwise, it's just the raw commodity that's exported, and I don't think that adds any value to Africa whatsoever. So we are, and we know that FAO and OECD are working on an investment protocol for Africa in terms of land, etc. And I think it's critical that governments adopt such a framework or a protocol, investment protocol for foreign direct investment, in which there's what we call responsible principles applied. Yeah. I think the banking sector, and Hans can help me here, but they have the Equator Principles, according to which is also a responsible investment protocol.
We'll be getting to that. Hugh, I just want to bring you into the conversation at this point. I mean, this entire scenario puts quite a focus on having the right skills base to start off with. I mean, the process of selecting who you actually partner with has got to be pretty rigorous. What kind of criteria do you look at when you're looking to make your investments out there?
Well, we're a very unusual fund. Whilst we actually get money from the development partners, from the British government, Dutch, Danish, Australians and others, to invest in innovative agribusiness deals across the continent. And obviously what those development partners want to see is an impact on large numbers of poor people living in rural areas of Africa. But they're also interested very much in sustainable development, and you can equate in this sense sustainable to profitable, because if these investments are not profitable, then the development impact won't be sustained. So I just wanted to go back a little bit to John's point that I mean, to me, it's not really about whether it's about commercial large farming or whether it's about smallholder farming. That most of the successful arrangements where these things work is actually a combination of the two. Without the technology being brought in by the commercial farm, about that center of excellence, then it's hard for smallholder farming to develop. And equally, if the larger commercial investments are not having some wider benefit on the community, and that is not just about doing corporate social responsibility, it's about actually affecting the incomes of the people there, providing jobs, providing increased incomes from the small farmers. And it's a question of getting that right, and that balance right, and also having the environment right, and also ensuring that the issues around land, which you've been talking about, are dealt with sensitively, are dealt with in relation to the law, and respecting not only the formal legal arrangements around land, but understanding there are informal rights on those lands too, and that the right deals have to be put together with the community and with the government.
Let's bring government into this equation of getting the right skills base in place. What role do you see government, Anthony, playing in this regard, especially where in most instances you have farmers not having enough information on new farming techniques like like what you're putting on the table?
In the case of Syngenta, if we talk about technology and education and training, it goes hand in hand, and that's pretty important to make sure that we address both those things.
Is government doing enough?
In terms of government, I think the involvement of government at the fairly senior level needs to happen in order to show the benefit and show the advantage to governments in various African countries if they do participate in these activities. In our case, we're busy establishing an African training academy, which will do exactly what you're talking about, training farm managers right across the region in Africa. Some of the training will even take place in South Africa. So you need the cooperation of governments, the coordination of governments to make sure that we bring this technology, not only the technology, but also the know-how in terms of growing crops sustainably and profitably. And that would alleviate even poverty if we can achieve that.
So inroads being made into tackling that challenge. Let's put on the table now infrastructure constraints and the kind of challenge this puts on the table for business operations, and viability of a business from the businesses you've assessed.
Well, definitely that places a big challenge, and I think it calls for, well, if we talk of government, calls for the coordination of all investments taking place. A number of the African countries actually just currently really starting to exploit their mineral resources. But we have got to exploit those, set up mining operations, bearing in mind that at some point those mining operations will come to an end, but those communities are going to remain. So the question is, if you take an example of Mozambique, you have large mining operations in Tete, but you've got to set up the rail infrastructure in such a way it's going to support agriculture in the end. Because the one advantage is that mining can afford to make investments into infrastructure.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you, because if you look at the investment models being used by miners operating, the private sector comes in, builds infrastructure around them to a large extent because they know that they need that to support their business. To what extent do we need to see agricultural players do a little bit of the same?
Now, this is where I actually call for a lot more government foresight in trying to see how that gets integrated into the agricultural operation, so that then your mining operation basically forms, should we say, the main line, and you have agriculture building your secondary or feeder lines into your main rail infrastructure, as an example. The other important element, of course, also is that the mines are building or increasing consumption of the local produce. So the question is, if you come and have a mine being set up, how are you linking it back into your smallholder producers so that they produce the food for the mines? So that you tend to have some other investment that happens within the local environment. The other point around government involvement is that, which would probably be a way of looking at it, is that a lot of governments, and I think Africa has done quite well in trying to improve revenue collection. That was always a problem, but most countries have sort of set up parastatals and collect revenue quite well. It would actually be the similar effort that has been set up in that structure that is required to manage or set up smallholders. Because the smallholders have got to be set up with a view of saying, how do you actually make them profitable? But they need extra support, and you cannot expect the smallholders to manage themselves. So it's what role can government play in collectively managing the smallholders to make them a profitable unit, knowing that on their own they're not going to be able to survive. And that's got to be the backbone of developing African agriculture.
John, it's certainly a long road ahead in terms of, jumping all these hurdles that that investors in the space have to. In the interim, government subsidies for developing this industry. I mean, we had Kenya subsidizing fertilizer, I remember, at a point to aid struggling farmers. The risk in that is that you create possibly a dependence on that, and it's a very fine balancing act that you've got to play there. So what's your view on that? Because it's good if it's responsibly managed to the end goal of those businesses becoming, at the end point, self-sufficient.
Yes, one has to take a global view on this, and the point was made too previously that we in a global environment. We do know that many countries, especially some of the first world countries, do still subsidize their agriculture. So it's tough to compete in that environment if you don't have some sort of protection or some sort of subsidies. Now, in South Africa, our subsidies are of the lowest in the world, and one should try and move to remove subsidies as much as possible. I don't think you can do it totally, and I don't think you can work without some form of tariff protection of industries to a certain degree. Where that balance is, I think, is very important. I don't think we always get that right. I am very wary of input subsidies because they tend to become political instruments, as happened in Malawi, and then to have an exit strategy for them is really difficult because you make people dependent on them. But certainly, I think smart support we should look at, perhaps not necessarily in the input side. I think governments are not investing enough in agriculture, are not investing enough in skills development, productivity increases, and I think that's where we can, the gains that we can make there can really benefit us tremendously.
Especially if you look at the potential. Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for having joined me at the desk today. Of course, Anthony Delport is South Africa country head at Syngenta. Hans Balyamajura is General Manager of Agribusiness Frontline and Africa over at ABSA. John Purchase, CEO of Agbiz. And then, of course, having joined us from our studios in Nairobi, Kenya, is Hugh Scott, Director at the Africa Enterprise Challenge Fund. And that's where we leave it for this edition of Invest Africa. We'll be back again, same time, same place next week. Until then, from me, Alicia Seckham, it's goodbye.